This video was brought to you by Brilliant, and the first 200 people to sign up using the link below will get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Having started his career as a somewhat controversial journalist, famed for bendy bananas and, well, getting fired a lot, Boris Johnson was able to rise to the highest office in the country, Prime Minister. However, the success of his rise couldn't be enjoyed for all that long, with Johnson's downfall as Prime Minister being one of the most dramatic in modern political history. So, with Johnson's premiership pretty much over, and the race to replace him ongoing, and us covering it in daily live streams, which you should absolutely watch, it seems like he has very little time left in office. So, now is a good time for us to evaluate his legacy. How will the outgoing Prime Minister go down in history? And how does he compare to his contemporaries? As I mentioned a moment ago, Johnson's career began as a journalist, originally getting a job writing for The Times, thanks to some family connections. But his time there was short-lived, as he was sacked for fabricating quotes in his articles. He then moved on to The Telegraph, and then finally became the editor of The Spectator. Following his time at The Spectator, though, Johnson decided that he wanted to become more involved in politics, and so put himself forward for Michael Heseltine's old seat of Henley. He would then return to Parliament by running for the Uxbridge and South Ruislip constituency. As an MP, Johnson was generally fairly socially liberal and quite loyal to the Conservative Party, rarely rebelling. But Johnson had his sights set higher than merely being a backbench MP. So in 2008, he ran as the Conservative candidate for the Mayor of London, with Johnson eventually beating Labour's Ken Livingstone. Johnson's time as mayor was moderately controversial within the city, but outside of London, Johnson's fame continued to rise, with him being seen as a funny and affable politician, and one that people trusted. Now, while Johnson was enjoying romping around London, promising garden bridges and getting stuck on zip lines, the national government was facing a bit of a crisis. That's because Johnson's own Conservative Party were tearing themselves apart over the issue of Europe.
Then Britain has its desires and requests to make sure that our relationship with Europe is properly managed.
I think Britain needs change. We have been promised change and reform by the Conservative Party, by the Cameron government. We haven't had the political reform that we desperately need.
In an attempt to settle the ship, then Prime Minister David Cameron opted to call a referendum on Brexit to try and put these issues to bed once and for all. Cameron, having negotiated a so-called special status for the UK, was campaigning on a platform for remaining in Europe, and he hoped that his friend and fellow Conservative Boris Johnson would campaign alongside him. And for a while it looked like he might, all the way up until he published an article emphatically backing the UK leaving the European Union, with this decision ultimately catapulting Johnson's stardom even further as the de facto face of the Leave campaign. So, when the results came in, Brexit won and Cameron resigned, many expected Boris to walk straight into number 10. However, after long-term friend Michael Gove stabbed him in the back in an attempt to get the job, Theresa May ultimately went on to win the 2016 Conservative leadership race, beating Johnson into Downing Street. Perhaps, though, this was a poisoned chalice for May. Tasked with sorting out Brexit, May faced one major issue. She just couldn't do it. And by 2019, 3 years after the referendum, Brexit was still far from sorted. The UK was still in the European Union, and Theresa May failed to get her Brexit deal through Parliament on 3 separate occasions. Now, considering that she was elevated to the leader of the Conservative Party with almost a singular purpose, it's not surprising that these failures pushed her government into crisis. Now, May was able to survive a no-confidence vote, but following a number of cabinet resignations and speculation that the 1922 committee might change their rules to allow her to face a second vote of no confidence, she eventually agreed to resign. A series of events that might sound familiar. Anyway, a new leadership election took place in the summer of 2019, and this time round, nothing was getting in Johnson's way, with him entering office almost exactly 3 years ago.
Nobody wants a hard border in Northern Ireland, and indeed, nobody believes that it will be necessary. The people who say that the planes won't fly and there won't be clean drinking water and there won't be enough, well, I say nonsense. Leaving on October the 31st was, my words were eminently feasible.
Heading into number 10, Johnson had one clear mission: not to make the same mistake that May did, and to get Brexit done. Having watched his predecessor fail in some rather humiliating ways, Johnson was willing to do literally anything he had to ensure that he wouldn't be condemned to the same fate, even promising to deliver Brexit within his first 100 days. To make that timescale possible, at the end of August 2019, Johnson opted to shut down Parliament, with many assuming that this proroguement was an attempt to prevent parliamentary scrutiny of his new Brexit plans. Unsurprisingly, this record-length proroguement faced legal challenges, something which would set a precedent for his premiership. Like many other legal challenges during his tenure, this one didn't go in Johnson's favour, with the Supreme Court ruling that the prorogation was null and void, and also finding that the Prime Minister had acted unlawfully in his decision to advise Her Majesty to prorogue Parliament in the first place. Determined to still deliver on Brexit though, Johnson decided that the best course of action would be to go to the public and secure a new mandate. He hoped that on the promise of getting Brexit done, he could convince the public to vote for him and force troublesome Remainers to clear his way to a unilateral Brexit. And this pitch certainly seemed appealing, with the electorate delivering what he described as a stonking majority against a beleaguered Jeremy Corbyn. And with a major win under his belt, Johnson was finally able to pull the UK out of Europe at the end of January 2021. Now, the atmosphere in Downing Street must have been jubilant, as the government had finally delivered what Cameron had offered and May was unable to execute. However, there was still work to be done on Brexit, and another crisis was on the horizon.
Concern is growing over a possible outbreak of a new SARS-like virus, the flu-like mystery illness first reported in China, already spreading to Japan and Thailand.
The Philippines has reported the first death from the new coronavirus outside of China. The death toll in China has now topped 300.
A woman in her 70s has become the first person with coronavirus to die in the UK. The number of people infected in the UK has jumped again to 116.
In March, Johnson finally realised that he needed to do something about COVID-19. He may have been slower to act than many wanted, but he finally realised that it was a real possibility that if he did nothing, the NHS would be put under some serious pressure. While he had allowed some key gatherings to take place in the weeks prior, it was clear that this was no longer viable. And on the 23rd of March 2020, Boris Johnson instructed the country to stay at home. About this decision, Johnson said that we're taking away the ancient inalienable right of freeborn people of the United Kingdom to go to the pub. But despite his initial jokes, it was over the next few months that Johnson was forced to battle the virus, at one point even contracting it himself. Johnson was also struggling a lot with his personal life at the time, and things weren't much better in number 10 at the time, with tensions running high due to a scandal that had emerged around Dominic Cummings, an advisor to Johnson, with the Barnard Castle incident being one of the first true scandals to shake public opinion around Johnson. But just because COVID had taken over the news cycle didn't mean that there weren't other issues to handle. For instance, while the UK had left the European Union, trade negotiations were still ongoing between the two sides. But by Christmas Eve 2020, Johnson was proud to announce that the UK had agreed a trade deal with the EU. A deal that he described as oven ready, but later didn't seem so pleased with. Regardless, this was good news for Johnson, and things got better in the new year when it was announced that the UK would begin rolling out the COVID-19 vaccine, the first country to do so anywhere in the world, which was also the beginning of Johnson's new rallying cry that under him, Britain was world-beating. These successes were short-lived though, because while the vaccine rollout was broadly praised, the number of coronavirus cases continued to rise in the UK, and before long the UK was in a third lockdown, something that Johnson was reluctant to do. Little did Johnson know at this point that his year was only going to get worse, with further difficulties beginning in April with the Downing Street flat controversy, whereby secret donors allegedly paid for the refurbishment of Johnson's flat in Downing Street. A leaked invoice suggested that the final cost of this refurbishment was north of £200,000, with items including a £7,000 rug, a £3,675 drinks trolley, £15,000 on 2 sofas, plus an extra £2,800 in fabric for them, and a £500 kitchen tablecloth. Now, Johnson denied that he got secret donors to pay for the refurb, but Johnson's ethics advisor published a report on the whole affair, where he stated that Johnson had been unwise to allow for a refurbishment without knowing how it was being funded. In the end, the Conservative Party was fined £17,800 for not disclosing the donations, but the public damage was definitely greater than that. The sense of scandal only increased in November, when Johnson tried to block the suspension of Owen Paterson, a Tory MP who was found to have engaged in paid lobbying. The Standards Committee recommended a 30-day suspension for Paterson, something which Johnson whipped his party not to support. But as outrage grew over this, Johnson was forced into an embarrassing U-turn. And from there, things got even worse. To begin with, the coronavirus was evolving, and case numbers were swiftly rising to their highest ever. And while COVID was becoming less deadly, it was becoming more transmissible. Not that that seemed to concern Johnson, because it was reported that after the second lockdown, Johnson remarked, "No more f***ing lockdowns. Let the bodies pile high in their thousands." Clearly then, he was reluctant to call for another lockdown. Some berated him for not investigating another lockdown at this time. But Johnson's decision-making here might have been influenced by the fact there was just a lot of anger around the country. That's because reports were emerging that Johnson's own government had held gatherings during lockdowns in 2020, when the rest of the country were forced to stay home. On top of the Partygate scandal, the country was also dealing with a petrol shortage, largely caused by a lack of HGV drivers. And this anger continued later into 2021, when the energy crisis only worsened due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Ultimately, the energy price cap was raised, meaning that families have to pay thousands more to heat their homes. Behind the scenes though, the Partygate scandal was continuing to rumble on, eventually seeing Johnson and his Chancellor Rishi Sunak being fined. This was despite Johnson assuring people that all rules were followed in Number 10, something that clearly wasn't the case, with him personally being handed down a fine. The addition of sex scandals into the mix of what was now becoming a prolonged crisis for the government certainly didn't help anything. That's because in early 2022, a Conservative MP was arrested on suspicion of rape. Then in April, Conservative MP Imran Ahmed Khan was arrested and subsequently found guilty of sexually assaulting a child. Then in May, Conservative MP Neil Parish admitted to watching porn in the House of Commons and subsequently resigned. And finally, in June, Deputy Chief Whip for the Conservatives, Chris Pincher, resigned after admitting that he groped 2 men in a bar that very week. Over the following weekend, it became increasingly clear that Johnson was simply losing the ability to handle the scale of these scandals. And the thing was that Pincher had actually been accused of misconduct before. Johnson claimed that he was unaware of these allegations and instructed his ministers to repeat this in TV and radio interviews. But it swiftly became clear that Johnson had actually been briefed on Pincher. And this was the breaking point for many of Johnson's loyal supporters. The fact that Johnson had knowingly appointed someone who was accused of misconduct was one thing, but ministers being forced to tell the media that Johnson didn't know when he reportedly did was another thing entirely. And as such, around 60 ministers resigned from government in a matter of hours. Now, no Prime Minister could sustain this very sudden loss of support, and after some resistance, Johnson agreed that he had to stand down. For those who still support Johnson, he'll go down in history for his ability to do what Theresa May couldn't, take the UK out of the EU. Once Brexit was done, his success in procuring vaccines and rolling them out across the country will be seen by his supporters as another of his greatest achievements. On a personal level, they will also see his huge personality as an asset, which helped him succeed where other politicians couldn't. To his detractors, though, he'll go down in history for toppling Theresa May and then effectively stealing her deal. The current issues in Northern Ireland will be seen as entirely caused by Johnson and his lack of understanding of his own deal. And on COVID, Johnson will be remembered for his refusal to lock down the country earlier and will likely be blamed for a lot of the excess deaths. His refusal to take responsibility for things and his people-pleaser attitude will also likely be seen as huge character flaws, which allowed his government to become so engulfed in scandals. And it was ultimately this poor judgment and poor problem-solving skills which sunk the Prime Minister, with these abilities always being at the heart of politics, whether it's making the electorate happy or trying to handle endless scandals. So if you want to be able to do what politicians often can't, then consider signing up to Brilliant. That's the STEM learning platform which actually features a class on the joy of problem solving. In that class, like all of their others, they use active learning techniques to help you learn complex subjects, like logical reasoning, deducing facts from fiction, and logic puzzles, with you learning through fun and engaging activities. These interactive classes cover all kinds of STEM topics too, from computer science and cryptocurrency to statistics and casino probability. So if you want to take your next step in STEM and support the channel at the same time, then you can sign up to Brilliant at brilliant.org/TLDR UK. And the first 200 people to do so will get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thanks for your support.